June 1942. Kharkov Front, Eastern Ukraine. Dawn crawled over a landscape of smoke and frost. The earth was blackened, scarred by endless bombardment. A lone birch tree stood twisted, its bark half peeled, its branches charred like bone fingers pointing toward the east. From a ruined church tower, a German spotter raised his binoculars. Below him, columns of Soviet armor stirred in the mist, heavy silhouettes rumbling to life, their engines coughing clouds of blue-gray diesel. The air trembled with the metallic rhythm of tracks grinding frozen soil. Inside the German command post, a gramophone played a waltz. Officers smoked, joked, poured coffee into tin cups. To them, this was routine, another day of hunting poorly trained Bolsheviks. Colonel Friedrich Hoss, veteran of the Blitzkrieg in France, leaned over the map and chuckled. They still don't understand speed. They think courage replaces strategy. Laughter filled the bunker, dry, confident, absolute. Outside, Soviet soldiers advanced through fog like ghosts who hadn't realized they were already dead. Every motion seemed clumsy beside the clockwork precision of the Wehrmacht. But amid that chaos, one pair of eyes wasn't fixed on the map. It studied the pattern, how the panzer struck, retreated, enveloped. Those eyes belonged to Mikhail Katukov, a tank commander watching his own army stumble into the jaws of German perfection. He spoke quietly to his adjutant. "They're not gods. They're predictable." A mortar shell shrieked overhead, the ground erupted, and the laughter in the German bunker turned to cheers, another Soviet assault crushed before breakfast. Yet, somewhere behind the smoke, Katukov made a silent vow. He would not imitate their courage, he would master their logic. He would learn the enemy's rhythm until he could play it better than they did. That morning, the German colonel believed he was witnessing another easy victory. But in truth, he was witnessing the birth of the man who would turn their lightning into thunder. What they didn't know was that on that day, they were hearing the first faint echo of their own destruction. When Mikhail Katukov returned from Kharkov, his convoy carried little more than twisted metal and silence. The smell of burnt oil clung to his uniform. The proud Red Army had been humiliated again, not for lack of courage, but for lack of imagination. He was 42, with eyes carved by sleepless nights and a voice that never rose above necessity. In his command tent, he spread captured German maps across a crate. Red and blue arrows, symbols of destruction, crisscrossed the paper like veins on a dying body. He traced them with a gloved finger and whispered, almost to himself, "They think in patterns. That means they can be broken." Katukov understood something that others refused to see. The Blitzkrieg wasn't magic, it was mathematics. Velocity, timing, synchronization. A machine built not from ideology, but from systems. Yet when he proposed studying German methods, his superiors called it heresy. To learn from the enemy was to admit inferiority. Soviet doctrine worshipped mass, not precision, quantity, not cunning. They told him, "Comrade General, Soviet steel needs no imitation, only faith." Faith. He'd seen faith melt inside burning tanks. So Katukov began his rebellion, not with words, but with experiments. He drilled his crews in new formations, sharp and fluid. Instead of charging in waves, they vanished behind ridges, struck from the flanks, and disappeared again. Engines exploded. track snapped under pressure. Gun barrels overheated from relentless live fire practice. He was called reckless, a destroyer of men and machines. Reports labeled his methods wasteful. One officer wrote, "Comrade Katukov's exercises show no discipline. The men act like hunters, not soldiers." Exactly. That was the point. He was creating something alive, something that could think, adapt, hunt. To perfect it, he studied not only the Germans, but also their philosophy of command. Auftragstaktik, mission command, initiative at every level. He began trusting his junior officers to act without waiting for orders, a radical concept in Stalin's army. Every tank became not a pawn, but a predator. His prototype division, small, bruised, undersupplied, trained in mud until their boots dissolved and their fingers bled from reloading. But their eyes gleamed with a new fire, confidence born not of slogans, but of understanding. Katukov often walked among them at night, listening to engines idling in the dark. He would rest his hand on the side of a T-34 and say, "It's not a tank anymore. It's a living creature, and we are its heart." By the spring of 1942, he had built something neither side could yet define. A force disciplined by chaos, guided by instinct, armed with insight. It was fragile, imperfect, doubted by all. But within that fragile experiment lay the blueprint of revolution. Nobody imagined that this apparent failure carried within it the seed of victory. October 1941, Mtsensk, near Oryol. The ground was cold, soaked with rain, and heavy with the metallic scent of fuel and mud. Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade stood scattered along a half-frozen forest line, fewer than 40 operational T-34s against over 200 German panzers. The Red Army called it defensive action. The Germans called it a demonstration of dominance. As dawn broke, the fog split to reveal black crosses on gray steel. Panzer III and IV tanks rolled forward in perfect formation, engines humming like a mechanical orchestra. The precision was hypnotic. In the Soviet positions, mechanics fought with frozen wrenches, wiping oil from numb hands. Half the radios failed before the first shot. Tracks jammed, engines sputtered. Inside his command tank, Katukov lit a cigarette and stared through the periscope. His adjutant reported, voice trembling, "Comrade General, they outnumber us 5-1. Katukov replied quietly, "Then they won't expect us to fight." The T-34s began to move, not forward, but sideways, sliding through the woods, flanking like wolves. Katukov's plan was to bleed the blitzkrieg, hit, disappear, strike again. For hours it worked. German advance columns slowed, smoke plumes marked burning tanks. But then the weather changed. The mud deepened. Soviet tracks tore apart under their own weight. Engines overheated. Visibility collapsed. When the order came to counterattack, half the brigade was immobilized. The Germans encircled them in a steel trap, firing in all directions. Flames reflected off the rain-soaked helmets of fleeing infantry. A surviving tanker later recalled, "The air was fire and screams. You could not tell if it was day or night, only the sound of shells tearing the world apart." In Berlin, newspapers celebrated another triumph. Photographs showed burning Soviet tanks, captioned, "The invincible T-34, defeated again." German engineers mocked the machine. "It flies like a brick and dies like one." Even inside Soviet ranks, doubt spread. Katukov was called reckless, accused of wasting men and steel on impossible maneuvers. He was summoned to Moscow for questioning. In his report, one phrase stood out: "Our losses are temporary. Their confidence is not." To the high command, it sounded like arrogance. To history, it was prophecy. That night, Katukov walked through the wrecks of his own brigade. Rain hissed on twisted armor. He placed his hand on a burnt T-34 hull and whispered, almost as a confession, "You did not fail. I failed to understand you." He realized then he had copied the enemy's moves, not their mindset. He had learned the mechanics of blitzkrieg, but not its psychology. The Germans returned to their camps, believing the front was stable, the Red Army crushed once again. They laughed, toasted, and wrote confident letters home. But in the ashes of Mtsensk, Katukov had seen the truth. The T-34 wasn't just a weapon, it was a canvas, and he hadn't yet learned how to paint with it. The world saw a defeat. He saw a rehearsal. The legend had been born in fire, but tempered in humiliation. Winter 1941, deep behind Soviet lines. Snow covered everything: roads, wrecks, graves. The front had frozen into stillness, but Katukov's mind hadn't. He spent nights under a flickering lamp, poring over field reports, mechanical logs, and fragments of German radio transcripts. He replayed every defeat like an engineer studying the crash of a prototype aircraft. Each mistake became a formula, each loss an equation waiting to be solved. The Germans called the T-34 clumsy. Katukov saw something else: forgiveness. Its wide tracks could crawl where panzers drowned. Its sloped armor turned German shells into ricochets of frustration. And its engine, a diesel heart that could survive what no gasoline tank could endure. He realized the truth. The Red Army didn't need to outgun the enemy. It needed to outlast him. "They win fast," he told his staff, "so we'll win slow." He redefined everything: movement, engagement, survival. Tanks no longer attacked in waves, but in layers. One line would lure, another would strike, and a third would vanish, waiting for the moment when German precision became overconfidence. He ordered every commander under him to memorize enemy routines: how long it took for panzers to reload, when they refueled, how they communicated, what they feared. They were no longer fighting the German army. They were fighting the German mind. By the spring of 1942, Katukov had turned his brigade into something unrecognizable. Each unit operated like a neural cell in a greater brain. Signals passed wordlessly, through smoke bursts, flashes, dust, instinct. It was chaos, but organized, a kind of mechanical jazz. In April, the first test came. A reconnaissance unit reported a panzer column approaching through a valley, 60 tanks, advancing without air cover. Katukov deployed just 16 of his own, but this time they didn't wait. The T-34s burrowed into the terrain, engines off, hulls camouflaged with branches and snow. Silence. Then, a single flare. The valley erupted. German tanks burned before they even knew where the shots came from. When they tried to retreat, Katukov's flanking units emerged from the tree line, cutting their escape routes like wolves closing a hunt. In 15 minutes, the valley turned into an inferno of shattered optics, ruptured steel, and screaming engines. Only 3 T-34s were lost. Katukov had done the impossible. He had broken the tempo of blitzkrieg. A German survivor later wrote in his diary, "It was as if our own tactics turned against us. They knew our rhythm and killed to it." From that day forward, his crews began calling him Ochentiki, the very quiet one. Because he didn't shout orders, he whispered them. And when he did, men listened like acolytes before a prophet. He had discovered the perfect weapon was not a tank, it was understanding. From now on, the Germans wouldn't just face steel, they would face reflection, their own doctrine mirrored, distorted, and sharpened by a mind that had seen through it. That battle was never reported in Soviet newspapers. It wasn't even considered significant in Berlin. But in hindsight, historians call it what it truly was, the first counter-blitz of the modern age. The monster had opened its eyes.
Summer 1943, Kursk. The largest armored confrontation in human history. Over 6,000 tanks, 2 million men, and one idea: supremacy through steel. The steppe stretched to the horizon like an open wound. The air shimmered with heat and the scent of gasoline. Flies swarmed over the corpses of yesterday's battles. And somewhere in that endless plain waited Katukov. By now, his division was unrecognizable from the Red Army of 1941. Engines whispered instead of roared. Movements were silent, deliberate, surgical. Every soldier knew his place not by rank, but by instinct. The Germans had come to Kursk with confidence, armed with their newest monsters, the Tiger I and Panther. Massive, almost invincible machines, their armor thick as bunkers, their 88mm guns capable of tearing a T-34 apart from over a kilometer away. German officers joked that no Russian tank will ever get close enough to see us. Katukov smiled at that arrogance. He had learned long ago, the greater the machine, the louder it dies. He ordered his tanks dug in, half buried in earth and brush, camouflaged until they were indistinguishable from the landscape. Their guns were pre-sighted for the exact range of the valley ahead. Crews waited in silence, sweat freezing under their helmets. At dawn, the first Tigers appeared on the ridge. Their turrets turned slowly, scanning. Then, without warning, the earth exploded. Dozens of concealed T-34s fired in perfect unison. Shells screamed across the steppe. The first Tiger erupted in a pillar of flame. German radio chatter dissolved into chaos. "Feind von allen Seiten!" Enemy from all sides. Within minutes, the coordinated Soviet barrage shattered the formation. Each time the panzers tried to regroup, another ambush detonated from a different direction. The battlefield became a labyrinth of smoke and deception, the exact opposite of the clean mechanical choreography the Germans worshipped. By midday, German intelligence reports changed tone. What began as expected Soviet resistance was reclassified unprecedented tactical counter-operations, extreme losses, enemy behavior irregular, unpredictable. Unpredictable. That single word, the death of blitzkrieg. The sound of the battle became its own legend. Witnesses said the air never went silent, only changed pitch. The staccato of machine guns faded into the rolling bass of tank cannons until the battlefield itself seemed to vibrate. The cadence of their guns was like continuous thunder, wrote one German sergeant later captured near Prokhorovka. When you heard it, you didn't think of fighting, you thought of surviving. By nightfall, entire German units had disintegrated. Dozens of Tiger tanks, once the pride of Hitler's propaganda, now lay silent, their hulls blackened, tracks twisted like broken ribs.
For the first time, the Wehrmacht realized they were fighting a mirror that learned faster than they could adapt. Katukov walked the battlefield in the fading light. The ground steamed with heat from burning metal. He said nothing, only looked, as if studying an equation that had finally solved itself. Word spread quickly through German lines. "Beware the quiet general. He sees before you strike. He is always where you least expect him." Psychological warfare had begun without a single leaflet or broadcast. The myth of German invincibility was cracked, replaced by the ghostly precision of the red armor. By autumn, reconnaissance units reported German tank crews abandoning their machines at the sound of distant diesel engines. Kotrukov's name became synonymous with terror. Entire panzer battalions requested to be reassigned away from his sector. The hunter had become the hunted. And every night, the thunder of Soviet guns rolled across the steppe, a reminder that lightning had found its master. The age of blitzkrieg was over. The age of counter-lightning had begun. The war was no longer about weapons. It was about ideas. By 1943, Mikhail Katukov had already rewritten the unwritten laws of armored warfare. But what he created was more than a tactic. It was a philosophy of power. The Germans believed strength came from perfection. They built machines so precise, so immaculate, that they seemed carved by arrogance itself. Every bolt, every line, every maneuver had to fit an ideal of control. To them, the Tiger tank was not a tool, but a monument. And like all monuments, it could not move. Katukov saw their flaw. They worshipped control in a world ruled by chaos. And chaos, he understood, could be studied, shaped, even tamed, but never dominated. He stopped commanding armies like machines. He began cultivating them like living organisms. Tanks, artillery, infantry, they were no longer separate parts, but cells in a single body. Each one capable of sensing, deciding, and striking on instinct. He didn't need perfection. He needed adaptation. In a system built on fear and obedience, that idea was heresy. Moscow demanded loyalty, not initiative. But Katukov defied the silence. He told his officers, "The map ends where reality begins. Don't wait for permission to survive." Orders became signals. Discipline became dialogue. Every soldier was allowed to think, not for himself, but with the whole. And through that unity of instinct, chaos began to obey. The Germans couldn't understand it. Their reports no longer spoke of numbers and coordinates. They spoke of confusion. "The Russians no longer fight as before," one officer wrote. "Our traps fail. They anticipate us. They are unpredictable." That word, unpredictable, was the death sentence of blitzkrieg. For the first time, the architects of lightning war found themselves blind in their own storm. Katukov had built something new, an army that learned. Each battle taught it something. Each mistake fed its evolution. It wasn't order that won the war. It was feedback. He taught his men 3 principles. Observe before acting. Strike when the enemy believes you are broken. And never fight the same battle twice. Those who followed him began to sense patterns invisible to others. They no longer reacted, they anticipated. They no longer fought, they adapted. Katukov's divisions became less like soldiers and more like instinct given form. In Berlin, the High Command spoke of Soviet inhuman coordination. They weren't wrong. It wasn't coordination, it was cognition. a network of men and machines that could think faster than command chains could respond. It was a living algorithm, a mind that had learned to think like war itself. To Katukov, that was the essence of power. Not domination, not control, adaptation. The Germans believed power was order. He proved it was survival. Perfection dies the moment reality touches it, but adaptation lives forever. He used to say, "The Germans built machines, I built a mind." And he did. An organism forged from defeat, refined through understanding, and unleashed through will. The more the enemy tried to predict him, the more they accelerated their own downfall. Every victory fed his evolution. Every loss made him faster, sharper, inevitable. He had turned imitation into innovation, repetition into intelligence, and pain into doctrine. His revolution wasn't loud. It moved quietly like thought itself, spreading from one division to another until an entire army learned to think as he did. By 1945, the once invincible Wehrmacht was reacting, retreating, unraveling. They had built monuments. He had built motion. In the end, his power came from a truth older than war itself. Systems that adapt survive. Systems that cling to pride perish. Mikhail Katukov had become the proof that intelligence, not might, decides the fate of empires. And as the guns of Europe began to fall silent, one truth remained. Those who learn faster than their enemies rule them.
Berlin, 1945. The city that once promised 1,000 years now burned in a single season. Streets cracked open under the weight of defeat. What had begun as lightning ended as smoke. Inside the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, the walls still trembled from distant artillery. German generals, once gods of the battlefield, stood in silence, faces pale, uniforms torn, eyes hollow. They had seen their empire built on precision dissolve into chaos. One of them whispered, "The Russians learned from us, then they surpassed us." No one answered, because the truth was unbearable. The laughter of Kharkov had turned into the silence of Berlin. Katukov's tanks rolled through the city like iron ghosts, their tracks clattering over the bones of arrogance. On their hulls, the red star reflected in the firelight, not as a symbol of ideology, but of endurance. Each tank carried a story, of failure, of adaptation, of rebirth. Every dent, every burn mark, every scar was a signature of evolution. The men inside those tanks said little. They didn't celebrate. They had outlived too many comrades to call it victory, but they understood what it meant. The enemy that had once been perfect had been undone not by strength, but by learning. Power, Katukov had proved, was never control. It was resilience. It was the quiet refusal to die the same way twice. He had turned defeat into doctrine, patience into a weapon, silence into strategy. He had shown that the mind that adapts is the only one that truly conquers. The irony was complete. The German blitzkrieg, the lightning that once terrified the world, had taught its own destruction. Its rhythms, its patterns, its arrogance. Everything that made it powerful had become its weakness. They had looked at the Soviets and seen chaos. They never realized that inside that chaos was calculation, and inside that calculation, something beyond control, understanding. The laughter of 1942 was gone. Only the sound of rain remained, falling softly on the ruins of their perfection. Katukov never boasted. He never called himself a genius nor a hero. When asked after the war how he had defeated the invincible army of Germany, he simply said, "I listened to them until they could no longer hear themselves." That is the quiet voice of mastery, not the roar of conquest, but the whisper of evolution. They laughed when they first saw him imitate their tactics. They stopped laughing when that imitation became annihilation. They had built lightning. He answered with thunder. And when the thunder spoke, the sky itself changed ownership. From that day on, war and power would never mean the same thing again.